Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 8th webinar of the ODA Learning Series 2020, co-organized by UNDP and OECD, and the third of 3 webinars devoted to green finance, co-organized with the Minister of Finance of the Slovak Republic. May I kindly ask some of you to open your videos? It would be great to see some faces if your internet allows. Hi, Clara. Hi, everyone. Hi, Veronica, Jan. It's great to see you all. Otherwise it feels like there are names and no faces. So it's great to have you all here. I wonder, before I continue further, it would be great to see who's in the room. I mean, in addition to opening the video, it would be great to see who's joining us for the first time. I'm guessing everybody has been here before, but you never know. So let's see. Could we have the poll, please, Kubra, to see who's joining us for the first time? So as I mentioned, this is our third of 3 webinars on green finance. So the question is, have you joined us in the past 2 weeks, or are you joining us for the first time? I mean, of course, there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to know, we just want to say hello and wave hands. That's all. Let's see. Of course, our speakers are joining us for the first time. So nice to see some familiar faces and new faces. So let's see. Great. Most people have been here with us. That's great. Thank you for continuing to join us every week on Thursday for 8 weeks already now. And yeah, welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. So in the first webinar, for those who are joining us for the first time, we revisited why we should be talking about green finance in the ODA series. And we looked at some examples, how financial institutions are helping with the green transition. And then last week, we had a very close look at green bonds, what it is, and how it works and what needs to be done. And we ended our webinar with our dear colleague, Joanne, reminding us how important it is to have a pipeline of investable projects in place. So we would like to pick up exactly where we left off. And then we have our colleague, Charles, to help us with that. But before we start with any of our presentations for today, we have another poll just to help us, Gosh, who's in the room, and it could be helpful for our speakers as they focus and explain some terms or not. So could we have the second poll, please, Kubra, on the background in finance? No, the other one, please, the background in finance one. Sorry, we have a number of polls for you.
So let's launch it in 2 minutes.
Sorry?
I will launch it in 2 minutes, just a second.
Okay, that's fine. Then I can look into our agenda for the day. Don't put the slides yet, Oni. It's great to see people. So as we wait for the polls, we have today in our agenda 2 very important points. We want to look at blended finance, and we want to look at what is all about this bankable projects that we're talking about. And we have 2 speakers. Okay, Oni, I take it back. Can we have the slide, please? For our agenda, we have 2 speakers. We are very delighted to have both of you here, Akif and Charles. We will have 10-minute presentation from both of our speakers, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A and discussions. And because as you all know, in the past, we were always running out of time when it came to discussion. So today we really wanted to dedicate plenty of time for Q&A. Charles, our colleague, thank you so much, Charles, for joining us today. I will give a little bit of introduction to both of our speakers, and for more details, please have a look at the speaker bios that we have shared with you, and also which is uploaded on the SparkBlue platform. Charles is an investments appraisal specialist for climate change, and he works across UNDP's Nature, Climate, and Energy team. And he leads the design and appraisal of climate and environment projects with a focus on crowding in investment from financial institutions and the private sector. Charles has a background in investment and corporate finance, and he holds a Master of Engineering degree from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Akif, thank you also, Akif, for joining us today. Akif is a manager at Convergence, which is the global network for blended finance, and he is responsible for capacity building among clients ranging from donor agencies, development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, and philanthropic organizations. He brings over 10 years of experience in the international business and development finance space. And Akif holds an MBA from the University of Toronto. And welcome to both of our speakers, and thank you so much again for joining us. So let's see, is the poll ready, Kubra?
Yes.
Great, that's wonderful. So just to see, it's a very simple question. Do you have a background in blended finance? Oh, it should be finance, actually. But yeah, it's basically we wanted to know if you have a background in finance, not blended finance. Just to see, you know, if where our speakers should be focusing on when they explain certain things. So let's see. Let's wait a second. No, all right. 22 people have background in finance. Again, it's about finance, right? It's not just blended finance. And majority of our participants, including myself, I don't have a background in finance. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to learn some things. So yeah, that is great. Thank you for participating in the poll. I hope that this gives a good indication to our speakers. And without further ado, shall we jump straight into the point where Joanne left us last week on the pipeline of investable projects? Charles, may I hand it over to you?
Thank you. If I could share my screen on the presentation, that would be great.
Then you can now. It's
Thank
open.
you. Okay, I hope that is working. I don't know how to minimize. Okay, good afternoon and good morning to some of you. It is great for you to be joining us today. My name is Charles. I'm an investment appraisal specialist working in Nature, Climate, and Energy team, as we just mentioned. I support a lot of vertical fund projects, such as Green Climate Fund, Global Environmental Facility, Adaptation Fund, and bilateral projects. Previously, before I joined UNDP, I'm more of working in the banking sector, looking at evaluating risks and return for capital projects and present the risk-return profile to CFOs of the bank to make investment decision. I will be really questioned whether I can cover the entire identified bankable projects in 8 minutes. And Joanne rightfully mentioned in the last call, you know, a lot of the finance option we're looking at assessing the new capital market tools such as green bond, SDG bond. You need to have pipeline ready. You need to have project that can be funded. So how do we look into some of these opportunities that come up to us and assess whether we could go ahead with it or we should really just stop thinking about it? So I just want to touch on some basic idea of what we can do when the risk investment opportunity coming to us, and how do we consider these opportunities. So I normally categorize development and donor-developed project into 3 categories. We can look at whether it is a pure public good investment. Examples of this type of investment is like climate information system, policy reform, government systems such as budgeting, planning, and pure public infrastructure such as seawall protection, infrastructure related. So for this type of project, we really consider the cost and impact efficiency. You will conduct economic cost and benefit analysis, looking at long-term, short-term impact, and consider the marginalized groups. For the other type, where we see this revenue potential for projects, such as public good investment with private sector involvement that have some potential revenue source. These are like utility infrastructure, like public building housing. In some developed countries, education and healthcare sector also fall into the category. Or the strict name, or what everyone want to call it, is PPP, public-private partnership. And then there's also mainly private sector-driven investment with some government support. These are very traditional project and investment opportunity in agriculture, extraction sector, manufacturing sector, and service sector. For these revenue-generating investment opportunities, we really need to consider the term bankability. And what does it really mean, bankability? It's simple to sentence is just the project is bankable or investable when lenders or investors is willing to uptake a project given the expected risk and return. So we really need to look at the risk-return profile as a main consideration. Secondly, we look at systematic and non-systematic risks. So systematic risks including liquidity risk, market risk, currency risk, interest rate risk. Non-systematic risk, it's basically business cycle. Are we in an up cycle, down cycle? How does this investment opportunity fit into the business cycle? And if you are having a lot of opportunity to invest in, which is great, then you also consider opportunity cost. So how do we discover the risk and return profile? Again, this is a really condensed slide, and apologies for this, but in 8 minutes to cover this is really a challenging task. For assess potential return is actually quite simple, because revenues come from projects can only come from a few forms, whether it's tariffs income, sales of goods and services, financial investment, tax and levy. Returns are easily to identify, but generally harder to measure and maintain. A certain level of revenue during project duration is the consideration. For risk is the hardest topic in sort of project formation and project appraisal, because risk management is core for any investment appraisal and investment decision process. There are generally two categories of risk. One is macro level risk. This type of risks are hard to measure, hard to mitigate, and we face on daily level with our project formation and our investment decisions. So in developing countries, we can see that macroeconomic political instability, poor rule of law can impact our revenue potential and the stability of revenue income. The lack of basic infrastructure, unclear regulation, can significantly increase project costs and making the project not financially viable. Many developing countries will work with, they are underdeveloped banking sector and capital market. So access to finance and access to capital become a problem. Borrowing costs can be expensive. And another thing with currency risk is one of the major risks in any cross-border international projects. Especially after COVID, when the global debt level is so high, we can see both for merchant donors and the partner countries, this currency risk can play a huge role in determining the bankability of a project. Lastly, a lot of economic activities can also determine risk, such as you have skill gaps in your labor, lack of business service industry. So even a project is financially makes sense, you could not actually implement because there's no project developer, there's no business advisory consultant to help you formulate the project. So those are macro level risks. Once you have a good understanding of macro level risk, you can start making a preliminary judgment on whether we can enter the market and conduct the project or not. Then you need to assess project level risk. These are very specific project related, determined on industry, sector, and location where you want to operate your investment project. Most of these risks are measurable and somewhat we can mitigate. For example, in the feasibility study stage in forming a project, we need to look at whether the product or service is affordable, whether there's a willingness to pay from a customer. This can really give you an understanding whether the revenue is sufficient or actually how much is the revenue, whether the revenue is sustainable for long term. For untested business model and region sector, there's a risk premium to it, which means it costs more to do business in untested sectors, in untested regions, in regions that normally not a lot of commercial, even donor projects are held. So this can actually increase the project operation and capital expenditure risk. And this can be mitigated somewhat by donor finance, concessional finance. We also run into the problem of project developer or on-ground people that we work with that need to implement a project are unused to dealing with banks, investors, and donors in general. So this can be mitigated by financial literacy training, capacity building into accounting, budgeting process, and training with relevant safeguard policies. Lastly, a very typical problem we see in a lot of emerging markets is high project origination preparation cost, long preparation time, small project size that are harder to get funded. So we can normally mitigate this by access into donor concessional finance, a range of financial tools to de-risk the project, such as guarantee, low interest rate loan, performance-based payment, blended finance, which the next presenter, Keith, is going to go into more detail with. So this sort of financial de-risking can help the project achieve a sustainable level of risk and return. Once we gather all this data, there's different way to evaluate whether a project is financially valuable or not. There's net present value calculation, IRR. I don't want to go into the detail of those because I think those are actually less important. The understanding of where revenue comes from, the understanding of what risks are out there, what risks are really predominant for your project, that can lead you and let you understand a set of assumptions that you need to work with in your project and investment. Those are more important than a simple financial model because the assumptions you made will determine the financial model's outcome. So when we talk about how do we adjust the risk and return profile, again, this is a very brief version, but we can look at through technical assistance, direct investment, and financial de-risking, these three common methods. And we can work with a range of partners to achieve this. Governments, ODA, UN system to help with technical assistance, international and domestic funding market to provide direct investment, working with donors, MDBs, IFIs, and a range of partners to find financial de-riskings. And back to the point of where Joanne is, if the capital market and banking sector is mature, you can access to capital markets such as green bond, SDG bond for those type of funding, if you have sufficient project to support it. Lastly, just want to discuss a little bit with what can emerging donors actually help. One, I think sharing experience is really important. Identify what sort of partnerships that you've worked with and share your partner country with the good working experience one and how to work with particular donor, such as, if it's vertical fund, how do we work with green climate fund? A lot of emerging donors already have experienced that. So that experience sharing is going to be critical. Design culturally, politically suitable projects because emerging donors normally operate in similar market landscape with their partner country. So designing a project or investment opportunity that are culturally, politically suitable can significantly reduce the project risk. Also, the donors could provide capacity building on procedures, investment process, and relevant processes, policies, if the emerging donor have a really good matured system to make this kind of decisions. Donors can also provide direct investment support, alignment to their own government programs, access to sort of global regional development programs, providing capital from the emerging donors market and access to the donors market and suppliers. Lastly, we can see synergy in project design and project formation, finding common interests, finding common issues to address, conduct projects that have trade potential, looking at transboundary projects, and actually learning by investing. So a lot of lessons learned we can actually get by doing investment ourselves. Merging donors make more investment, they could actually translate some of the knowledge to their own development agenda. So how could UNDP help you? We are here to really help merging donors and all global partners to find bankable projects and find projects with high impact potentials. We could work on market intelligence together, looking at some of the fundamental risks, climate information, and the basic market landscape. What are baseline investments? We can conduct evidence-based assessment of risk assessment, feasibility study. We could work together to assess sort of environmental and social risks, since we've already worked in many of the partner countries. We could also share stakeholder engagement and partnerships and provide financial products and fiscal policy support mentioned by Joanne, where we're supporting green bonds in Indonesia and green sukuk in Indonesia specifically. And we can look at sort of agile analytic to evaluate project impact and results. So I want to close by talking a little bit about my team, the UNDP's Nature, Climate, and Environment and Energy team. We work in 6 practice areas: sustainable energy, climate change adaptation, forest management, biodiversity and ecosystem services, water and ocean governance, chemicals, and waste. We will operate in 142 countries with a $5 billion portfolio. So we really like to work with merging donors to find good projects to work together, to partner with you and support you to find the bankable projects together as well. So lastly, thank you very much. That's all. Unfortunately, due to the time duration, it's hard to cover everything about investment appraisal in a minute, but I hope this gives a brief sense of what we can do and pointers of what are some of the key things to consider in making a decision for a bankable project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And apologies for the impossible task of explaining the whole of everything around bankability and pipeline of investable projects in 8 minutes. But I think considering the time constraints, I think you did amazing job of giving the first, the flavor of what we're talking about when we hear bankable or, bankability and investable. So before we move on to the next speaker, I wonder if there's any question right now to Charles, whether it be for clarification or just, like burning question right now. Please feel free to unmute your mic and ask Charles now, if you prefer, or we can come back to the questions in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So going once, twice, nope, okay, that was your opportunity. No, we will come back to Q&A, and perhaps it's also good to do it at the end because it's kind of also very much related, I think. So let's go to Akif now. Akif, I introduced you briefly, and thank you so much again for being here. We are very, very delighted to have you as Convergence, as many of you may know, is the, dare I say, the authority on blended finance. So yeah, thank you. The floor is yours, Akif.
Hi, Saran. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Bonjour tout le monde, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you today. Thanks to Saran and the United Nations Development Program for inviting me to speak about blended finance today. A topic that is very interesting and has taken up a lot of significance within the OECD and the international development community. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you today, and I'm looking forward to spending the next few minutes unpacking this particular theme and this particular topic. and answering any questions that you might have. So, before we jump in, maybe a little bit of a story around Convergence. Maybe you could go to the next slide, please. So Convergence, as Saran mentioned, is indeed the global network for blended finance. We were set up 5 years ago on the margins of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda meetings, the Financing for Development meetings, which put a price tag on the SDGs, but also was convened in order to think about how we finance the SDGs. I'm sure all of you have heard that in order to achieve the SDGs, the price tag in developing countries is around $2.5 trillion a year. If you add up all the OECD development assistance money that's flowing every year, that's around $150 billion. And indeed, that's stayed flat, and we expect that to contract this year as global GNI shrinks as well. So as you can imagine, we have $150 billion of OECD DAC money, a $2.5 trillion funding deficit and a funding gap. Well, where is the money going to come from? Who has the money? $2.5 trillion is around 3% of global GDP. It's around 1% of the value of global capital markets, around 14% of total annual savings. So the money is there. The money is there. It's with the private sector. The real question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we mobilize the private sector and get them off the sidelines and get them investing and involved in projects that you and I care about, in geographies that you and I care about. So this is really where blended finance comes in. And that's why really Convergence was set up to do two things. One is to get transactions off the ground, to build a pipeline of bankable projects, as Charles was alluding to earlier, get those projects financed, but also build a community of practice around good practice blended finance. So we spent a lot of time working with a lot of global governments in helping build their capacity to do better and more effective blending. So we work very closely with a range of your partners in the OECD DAC community, from Switzerland to Norway to Canada and to everybody in between. May I go on to the next slide, please? We are a member-based organization. As you can see, we have a membership that comprises of not just donor agencies, but DFIs, MDBs, commercial banks, private equity firms, philanthropic organizations, and really everyone in between, because blended finance is the epitome really of SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals. And the definition, when we speak about blended finance, and the definition is all these different parties coming together to get transactions off the ground and to get transactions financed. So let's unpack the definition. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is blended finance? You might have heard this term, and I think hopefully this session helps you unpack and demystify this particular terminology. So blended finance is really the use of development funding, as you can see on the bottom of your screen, development funding from public and aid agencies and donor agencies like yourselves, and or from philanthropic funders such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. That's really used and on concessional terms or below market terms or asymmetrical terms to mobilize private capital that's sitting on the sidelines, private capital or privately placed capital from commercial organizations or commercially priced organizations, like indeed even DFIs and MDBs, on market rate terms into blended finance structures. So it's development funding on concessional terms with the expressed intent of mobilizing private capital into projects and into geographies that they would not be mobilized into otherwise. Next slide, please. Now, let's unpack that with one level deeper. What are some key characteristics that we see of a good practice blended finance transaction? Number one, should have leverage. The concessional capital that's provided by donor agencies or foundations should be used to mobilize the commercial capital that's sitting on the sidelines. Because as I mentioned, the money is there, it's sitting on the sidelines. How can we change the risk-return trade-off and ratio so that those commercial investors are mobilized into these particular projects and these particular transactions? Number two, very, very important to have development impact. All of you belong to donor governments. And so donor governments and foundations that are in blended finance transactions are in there to buy, develop, and impact at the end of the day. Blended finance is a means to an end. It's not an end of itself. Develop and impact is the end of itself, and blended finance is the way in which you can mobilize higher volumes of financing ultimately to achieve the SDGs and achieve develop and impact. So it's very, very important to make sure that the underlying activities contribute to the SDGs. However, not all parties in a blended finance transaction need to have develop and impact, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And number three, by definition, if you are crowding in commercially priced capital or private capital and commercially priced capital is expecting or is looking for some sort of financial return. And so you need to support transactions that have an underlying business model that can pay back an investor over time. So it's very important to think about leverage, which is mobilization, develop and impact, which is what the public of development capital is buying, and then returns, which is the interest and intent of the private capital that's in these transactions. Next slide, please. Can you click one more through? And one more, please. Thank you. So blended finance is a structuring approach. You know, oftentimes people conflate blended finance with impact investing. Impact investing is an investment thesis or is an investment approach, whereas blended finance is a financial structuring approach. So you can have impact investors in blended finance transactions, excuse me, but not all blended finance transactions need to have impact investors within them. You could have a Rockefeller Foundation, the Polish Development Agency, and Bank of America in the same transaction, and none of them are impact investors in a sense. So blended finance really combines aid and philanthropy, impact and social investors, and commercial investors, all of whom, as you can see, have different characteristics, whether they be return expectations, liquidity requirements, risk appetites, and so on. And what blended finance neatly does is it combines all these three disparate approaches into one structure where each actor or each participant can take on an acceptable risk return profile and achieve their objectives. And I'll walk you through an example a little later on and you can see what I'm talking about. Next slide, please. So we at Convergence play a role in terms of trying to estimate the global market for blended finance. As you know, the OECD has come up with blended finance principles through the 3 Hitakarana roadmap for blended finance. We're working on bringing those principles into practice. We have different committees, different guidance notes for a lot of donor agencies into how to actually move from principles to practice. But what you need is, of course, data and evidence to understand what has been done, what is being done, so that you can make better decisions and be effective stewards of your taxpayer money. So blended finance to date, we've seen the market achieve around $140 billion in total financing to date across 512 transactions. As you can see, it's been growing over time. 1,170 unique investors have participated in blended finance, whether they be through technical assistance, providing guarantees, providing a straight up grant, or even participating within the capital structure of a particular fund. There's various different ways in which these investors can participate, but blended finance is definitely growing. It's definitely here to stay. And as you can see, the market has been accelerating over time, not just in terms of deal count, but also in terms of aggregate deal flow. Next slide, please. So which are the various sectors which are more amenable to blended finance? If you recall in a couple of slides ago, I mentioned to you that return is a really important consideration for blended finance transactions. So as you can imagine, sectors that lend themselves well to commercial activity, energy, infrastructure, financial services, have an above average representation and proportion insofar as blended finance is concerned. Education and health, which have primarily been funded in the classic ODA way through classic grants, are not very well represented in blended finance because you don't really have too many business models that lend themselves well to underlying cash flows. Of course, in health, you can have health diagnostics, maybe healthcare delivery through telemedicine, But ultimately, in many countries, the provision of health is still very much a public sector undertaking. And so health, education are not very well represented, but many donors, especially in light of COVID now, are thinking about how can we attract more private sector financing in the health space. And that would require thinking about what sort of business models lend themselves well to private sector financing. And that's where I think Charles and his team come in, potentially thinking about building a pipeline of bankable projects that can potentially be funded. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of key investors that have participated in blended finance in a concessional way, or even in a commercial way, or in a quasi-commercial way, in the last few years, we've compiled a league table of different participants, and as you can see from the development agencies and multi-donor side, no surprises for guessing. The American government, the British government, the Swedish government, and the French and the Germans are quite active, of course, with the European Commission in supporting blended finance projects, and of course, even their DFIs, whether it's Proparco or CDC or DEG, they're quite active in this particular space. Of course, IFC, very active participator in blended finance. And as you can see, there's a range of different commercial investors, impact investors, philanthropic organizations that are also quite active in this particular space. So as an emerging donor, when you think about potentially participating in a blended finance transaction or thinking about how to structure a blended finance transaction, it would be helpful to look at this particular league tables to know which governments are doing it well, which governments have a stream of practice in this particular space, and actually understanding what they have and haven't done. So for example, if you look over here, CEDA is a quite active participant in blended finance because CEDA has a very interesting and innovative guarantee program. Over and above, of course, the 0.7% of ODA spending and funding that they have, because as you know, guarantees are not counted as part of ODA unless and until they're actually called. So there's a little challenge around accounting for guarantees and then hence building guarantee programs. Next slide, please. So let me walk you through a more tangible and concrete example that might bring this concept to life. There is an interesting transaction called Climate Investor One that has reached financial close recently and has managed to crowd in around $850 million of concessional and commercial funding. In many countries, in many projects, as Charles mentioned, you've got small ticket sizes, you've got individual country risk, you've got project risk, and so on and so forth. So how do you either mitigate risk, shift risk to those who can perhaps bear those risks better, or even enhance returns? So Climate Investor One has actually put together a very interesting transaction where they've bundled renewable energy projects from across a portfolio of different countries, and they've walked them through a life cycle approach. So for example, they have 3 different funds. The first fund is called the Development Fund. It's USD $50 million, fully financed by donor agencies such as the Dutch government, the American government, the British government, and so on. And this particular development fund is used to build a pipeline of bankable projects or to provide technical assistance to those projects. So if you're setting up an independent power project in Nigeria, you want to do the various technical assessments, the various structuring of the power purchase agreements, and so on and so forth. You need some sort of development funding in order to build that bankable project, and that's funded through this development fund, purely financed through development loans and technical assistance. And in many cases, when these particular transactions go on to raise additional financing, those loans are recycled back into this development fund, and it's a recycled approach. Once the project is structured and it's ready to start construction, the construction equity fund comes in and provides financing to actually build the project. Now, within the construction equity fund, you've got 3 tiers of capital: donor capital, commercial capital, and of course, institutional capital. Each of these layers of capital have a different return expectation. They're structured differently. And as you can imagine, the donor capital is structured in a much more concessional way, such that it changes the risk return for the institutional layer, such that that particular tranche of funding becomes more attractive to those institutional investors. So in theory, those institutional investors would not be in this transaction, or those commercial investors in tier two, which happen to be a lot of DFIs and MDBs, would not be in this transaction if they were not de-risked by the donor capital in the concessional tranche, and indeed had this pipeline of bankable projects that's already been gone through a quality control and some technical assistance and has been provided with development funding. Once the transaction has been constructed and is up and running and is spitting cash flows, then it needs to be refinanced, and the refinancing fund comes in. That's purely commercial, and that provides these transactions with senior debt so that these transactions can scale, because now they have underlying cash flows that can pay back investors. So here you've seen is a neat example of how donor money from a range of different aid agencies have come together and they've pooled their resources to de-risk projects, not just on an individual risk basis, but an aggregate risk basis as well. And it's led to the effect of crowding in serious commercial money that would not have been there otherwise. Because individually, what you have is an individual wind farm here and a solar farm there, but you really need to aggregate and bundle to structure away some of these risks that I think Charles alluded to earlier. This is one of the larger blended finance transactions. It's fully aligned to the Paris Climate Accords, and that's why a lot of governments have also looked to back this particular transaction. This transaction has been quite successful, as I mentioned, and now they're looking to raise Climate Investor 2 that's focused on the water and sanitation space. Next slide, please. Can you click through, please? So just, I've listed a few different efforts that have been underway in the global policy landscape to institutionalize and to scale and mainstream blended finance. As I mentioned, the OECD has done a great job in the blended finance principles, especially the DCD in terms of the guidance notes, and of course the Trihita roadmap for blended finance. Our colleagues at the multilateral development banks and DFIs have also been working on blended finance principles. The G20 is quite active in this particular space, especially as MDBs go for capital increases. They've been asked to optimize their balance sheet, and one way to optimize their balance sheet is to structure it in a way and offload some of the risks to the private sector, and one way to do that is through blending. So that's another interesting activity, and that's been ongoing. At the G7, through the leadership of the government of Canada last year, the 2X challenge was announced. So a lot of different DFIs are aiming to leverage blended finance to address gender issues. The European Union and the External Investment Plan has a strong role for blended finance. The European Fund for Sustainable Development is a very, very interesting guarantee program that have issued up to $1.5 billion of guarantees. That's gone on to mobilize a range of additional private financing. And of course, the World Bank with the IDA replenishment as well has pushed IFC and MEGA to take on more risk in low-income countries, and have provided them with those $2.5 billion worth of financing in order to push the risk envelope a little bit further. So these are a few different activities that are going on in the international policy space just to keep an eye on, and that has provided a lot of tailwinds for blended finance. Next slide, please. And in conclusion, next slide, please. Yeah, and in conclusion, I wanted to talk about a few steps that are required to institutionalize and scale mainstream blended finance. One is public funders really requiring greater knowledge and capacity to invest in blended finance. And a forum like this is very, very helpful to build the capacity and build a greater knowledge of emerging donors to take part in this space. In fact, the OECD did a study of the 30 DAC countries, and we found that around 17 DAC countries of the 30 have blending programs. So we'd love over time to see the balanced countries as well get into the blended finance game. Very, very important to align assets to investor requirements and preferences. Oftentimes you see transactions that have been structured and are then being shopped around to investors. Very important that when you are structuring a transaction right from the outset, it's important to bring an investor in at the early stage and really work with them to understand what they would or would not invest in. Intermediaries like Convergence, like the Global Impact Investment Network, even indeed like UNDP are also really essential to this equation to disseminate trends, best practices, and share knowledge. Building capacity of OECD donors is one piece, but it's also important to build capacity of recipient countries. And I know UNDPs are doing a great job in that space as well. We're working with the Ministry of Finance in Nepal or Rwanda and other countries to really build the frameworks required to receive a lot of this portfolio and FDI investment that will flow into their countries. And indeed, also these countries have a capacity to originate these transactions as well. And also there's a big requirement for early stage concessional capital. You donors have the risk-taking ability to take on some early stage risk because you have patient capital at the table. So I really, really encourage you to take on some early stage risk and to be that catalytic capital that can really unlock a lot of commercial financing that comes later on down the chain. And of course, donors and investors also require actionable blended finance data. We don't want to distort markets. We want to be additional. We want to keep into account minimum concessionality because you are stewards of public money at the end of the day. So these considerations are important and you need data and evidence to make those decisions. So I'll leave you here with these thoughts. Just wanted to introduce the concept to you, to introduce some of my thinking to you, and to talk to you a little bit about some of the trends that I've observed in the space. Happy to take any questions. And again, thank you to UNDP for inviting me. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Akif. I think, I mean, I didn't cut you off after 8 minutes, but I think it was very, very enlightening and illuminating for all of us. Thank you so much. So it turns out we have much less time for Q&A as originally planned. So please, please start sending your questions in the chat box, or please feel free to unmute your mic. I have a lot of questions. I don't know if I can ask those or we should wait for participants. Because, I mean, maybe I can start with my questions and then other people can come in as well. Akif, I was reading all this criticism about blended finance being heavily concentrated in middle income countries rather than those, those who need it most in the lower income countries. And also the rate of, I mean, the concessional versus private investment was very critical, right? I think it was ODA and others writing about how much public finance is going to, hardly leveraging, rather almost subsidizing, right? Yep. So if you could comment on that and how we could make it better. I think you made actually a few remarks during the presentation that there are efforts to change that, but that would be great if you could elaborate on that. Thanks. And to Charles after Akif, I have a question on attracting finance for climate change adaptation, because many of this investment that we are looking at are in the graph that Akif showed as well, as in the where the money is going is like climate. But if you look at climate, it's always mitigation, right? Renewable energy and those sectors. But the climate change adaptation, especially for the most vulnerable countries, is very, very important. So if you could, after Akif, share your thoughts on how we could, attract more investment in the adaptation space, that would be great. Thank you.
So Saran, you're absolutely right. If you look at the data that we've collected ourselves, and I know UNCDF, your colleagues in the Capital Development Fund, are doing a lot of work in this space as well, and I'm working with them on thinking about this. But yes, absolutely, you're right. A large proportion or disproportionate amount of financing has flowed to middle income countries, India, Peru, Kenya, and not enough to Malawi, Burkina Faso, and Ecuador, and Fiji, and so on. And there's a reason for that. As I mentioned earlier, we need some sort of return consideration. And in many of those countries, the risk-return dynamics just don't make sense. The risk is just way too high. The perception of risk sometimes versus the reality of risk is a massive issue there. Small ticket sizes, currency risk. So all the different risks really are more acute in a Malawi as compared to a Kenya. So even when we see sub-Saharan Africa has received a disproportionate amount, well, if you look, it's just 5 or 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or it's not, South Sudan, for example, or Somalia. Of course, also lack of bankable projects and so on and so forth. There's not a whole lot of quality projects in that particular space. So organizations like UNDP or even, the aid or agencies and emerging donors have, embassies and missions in these countries. Why can't we all work together to really build the private sector, the government capacity, regulation, and so on? So not just you have enabling environment from a policy side, but you also have the private sectors that actually have these bankable projects that can then be bundled and then funded through a blended approach. So yes, we have seen this, and over time, I hope to see a change, but you're absolutely right. We're not seeing enough of that. And, UNCDF's report's coming out soon, and I don't think there'll be a lot of difference in what they're reporting this year versus what was reported last year. Secondly, you're right. Blended finance has received some degree of criticism from ODI. I'm not here to say blended finance is a panacea to solve all the SDGs. I think there is a issue around setting expectations. I think the billions we got ahead of ourselves with the billions to trillions narrative. It's definitely a billions to billions game for sure, at least at the moment. Look, we didn't even have a definition 2 years ago. We didn't have any policy coherence a few years ago. That's what we're doing with the OECD and a variety of different donor governments in different countries, so that when somebody is sitting in Tokyo or when somebody is sitting in Ottawa, you have the good practices and principles by which you can apply donor funding. Because right now you've got not too much policy coherence, not enough data and evidence. So you're right, there's blended finance hasn't been done correctly. So hopefully through working with the donor side, we would get to a place where we have good practice blended finance, so it's done more effectively. We did a study to look at leverage ratios, and we found that $1 of concessional capital goes on to crowd around $4 of commercially priced capital. But of the 4 commercially priced capital, around 3 is commercially priced capital from MDBs and DFIs themselves. Arguably, that should be the job of MDBs and DFIs, and we can get into a whole different discussion of are they fit for purpose and so on and so forth. And I know many countries on the screen today are shareholders of these different governments, so I think you can encourage them to be I encourage them to be mobilizers rather than managers of resources. So, and there's issues around, why and how, and incentives within these organizations themselves. But you're right, big problem in terms of leverage and in terms of expectation. And if I may just answer, maybe the question you asked Charles as well, we're seeing more within the green finance space, we're seeing more financing flows towards mitigation projects rather than adaptation projects. And that's because, again, comes back to return. Not many adaptation projects have an underlying cash flow or a private model that can pay back an investor over time. Very few projects have been structured in that way. The moment they're structured in that way, you'll see financing flowing to them. A solar power plant or a hydropower dam and so on and so forth have cash flows. Not very many mitigation projects are structured in that way. So I'll stop there. Hopefully I've answered those 3 questions, and maybe I'll yield the floor to Charles to provide his perspective on this topic.
Yeah, I think Keith captured it very well. Adaptation is very difficult in terms of measuring the cash flow and return. And frankly, adaptation is much more grassroots problem that is linking to all sectors. You're looking at farmer level. So whether education on farm level is rifle enough, whether it's basic infrastructure at village level, all will impact the adaptation side of the issue. But we are trying different things to work on adaptation financing. One is actually a blended finance project we're doing in Latin America, working with the development banks and local banks, offering different type of loans to local livestock farmer and that operate in a region to make sure they adhere to zero deforestation. And also soybean producers that adheres to zero deforestation and land management. Once they attended the UNDP Green Climate funded program, they will get a certificate. That certificate will allow them to access a lower interest rate debt from the financial institution, which is blended through a development finance institution. So that's one way of doing it. Another angle I can look at it is aggregate a lot of things. We were doing quite a lot of farm level working with farmer cooperatives in African country. What we realized is many of the farmer cooperatives, while their main goal is to help farmers with equipment and stuff, they actually do lending themselves because they just couldn't get access to capital. So when we find a few of these countries, we were thinking, can we actually access to, a guarantee to cover this farmer cooperative and then integrate them into the actual banking system, into the national bank along with donors. So those aggregation, those identify new ways of practice, working on parallel with donors are all different ways to working adaptation. In Vietnam, where there's a major donor-funded infrastructure and government-funded infrastructure irrigation project, we are providing funding from vertical funds to support the last mile linkage. So while the irrigation covers the entire provinces of farmers water irrigation, we're trying to link those farmers that could not get access to because they're so remote. So the last mile linkage, we're trying to get donor finance to make sure the last mile or all the farmers are covered in that region. So parallel financing is also another option. So there's a variety of ways that we could work. Again, it is early stage and I fully agree with that. But I think with time, we need to figure out better models, business models that support adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you, Akif and Charles. There's a question in the chat box. Akif, do you want to take that one and then
sure.
We wrap? Thank you.
The question around guarantees, right?
Yes.
So currently as we speak, at the OECD, the way the calculations around ODA is done is still very much in the old school mode. Doesn't take into account a lot of private sector financing instruments. There have been discussions on the sidelines, but as you can imagine, trying to achieve consensus with 30 donor governments, all with different political considerations, can be quite challenging. Guarantees are very, very important. They are my favorite instrument because I think they're a very effective way of using limited donor government money to mobilize additional financing. Why? Why? Because, as I mentioned earlier, in many of these countries, there is a big gap between the perception of risk and the reality of risk. And if I can provide, or if one can provide a guarantee, guarantees are a very effective tool to reduce that gap between the reality and perception of risk, because over time, you can decrease the amount of guarantee and get that investor much more comfortable in investing in that particular asset class or that particular geography. Now, as we speak, it's not being counted as the OECD. The OECD is looking at TOSD, the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development. And so these considerations are being looked at, and I hope over time they will be passed. But many donor countries are at the moment in the game of trying to get first their ODA up to 0.7%, if that has not already been done so. Sweden, the Commission, of course, and USAID, of course, now through the DFC, have done a great job in providing guarantees for development. But when I speak to very many other donors, Switzerland, France, Norway, and so on, they all tell me, yeah, we are interested in guarantees. But up until it's not counted as ODA, I don't have an incentive to actually structure and put together a guarantee program. Well, as the Swedes tell me, we're already over 0.7%. So, I have no issue in terms of issuing guarantees. So only when guarantees are actually called and the counterparty actually defaults, that's only when guarantees are actually counted. And in many cases, if you look at the Sweden's program, in many cases, this is not even being called. I mean, you could ask the question, then are they taking enough risk? So this is the main issue around guarantees. It's a very great tool, but because of these lack of incentives, so to speak, within the policy framework, you're not seeing enough of it. But I would love to see more of it because I think it's a very effective way to crowd in additional financing while being very judicious with taxpayer money.
Thank you, Akif. if I was a representative of a civil society organization, I may argue with that point of, because, for example, following the announcement of the EU with the European Sustainable Finance, that fund that you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Big criticism was that there's such a huge chunk of money allocated to guarantees, which then could actually reduce the grants that many countries actually need. And again, the guarantees make the finance flow to middle-income countries. Again, we're going back to the other discussion. But the good point is that we can, now we don't have time for that, but next week we are starting with our 2 webinars on mainstreaming and aligning climate and environment with development assistance. And we will have representatives from OECD who will talk about how this is reported. Actually, we had a discussion with Sonia and the others from Slovak when the first green finance webinar about how this green finance or ODA money for environment and climate is counted in the ODA, etc. So I think we will have the opportunity to continue that discussion, not only concerning guarantees, but also other contributions that donors are making, and which is great because we will have 2 more webinars on the topic. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and a special thanks to our 2 speakers, Charles and Akif. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for covering such a hugely complex topics in such a short amount of time. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone when I say this was fantastic. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone. And yeah, see you next Thursday.